A currency does not fall in a single day. It weakens in small invisible steps. Most people never notice the early signs. But the historical record shows the same pattern again and again. In 1923, the German mark lost value so quickly that families carried bills in baskets. Archived photographs show workers being paid twice a day because wages lost buying power by evening. According to old newspaper accounts, a loaf of bread rose from 1 mark to millions in less than 12 months. It happened slowly at first, and then all at once. This matters because currencies sit beneath every part of daily life: savings, insurance, pensions, grocery budgets, retirement plans. They all rely on a unit of value that we trust without thinking. When that unit fails, everything around it shakes. Many people remember moments when a price suddenly felt wrong: a weekly bill rising, a familiar item costing more, a feeling that the numbers on the receipt did not make sense anymore. Those small moments are often the only warnings ordinary people receive. Have you ever wondered why some families seem to stay steady, even in the worst financial storms? The answer is not luck. Across every currency collapse, 5 specific assets reportedly kept their value. They appear again in the archives of Vienna, the records of Buenos Aires, the files of Moscow, and they still appear today. The story of how these 5 assets survived when entire currencies failed begins in a place most people overlook. And it began much earlier than you might think. The real story begins long before a currency starts to fall. It begins in the first small decisions governments make when they face pressure. According to archived budget records, the German mark showed strain as early as 1919. The numbers were not dramatic. They were simply a little worse each quarter. Most people were focused on rebuilding their lives after the war. Few paid attention to the quiet rise in short-term borrowing by the state. The same pattern appeared in Austria in 1921. Officials reportedly issued temporary notes to cover routine payments. They described them as minor tools to smooth the economy. In reality, those notes opened the door to more printing. Once that door opened, it rarely closed. An overlooked detail often starts the chain. In Argentina, in the late 1970s, a small change in export taxes pushed local businesses to shift money abroad. According to old central bank reports, this forced the government to borrow more in foreign currency. That one choice set the stage for the collapse that followed. People living through these early moments rarely sense danger. A shop owner might notice that suppliers ask for payment a little sooner. A retiree might see a pension adjustment arrive with a brief explanation. These moments feel personal, but they are early signals of a system under strain. Do you remember a time when officials assured the public that everything was under control while numbers quietly drifted in the opposite direction? Because once these early signals appear, a larger shift soon follows, and it often arrives faster than anyone expects. The first major shift usually comes when confidence begins to slip. It does not collapse instantly. It changes in small, measurable steps. According to archived price indexes, the German mark lost almost half its value between January and July of 1922. Most newspapers mentioned it only briefly. But merchants reportedly noticed that suppliers preferred payment in foreign currency. That was one of the earliest signs that purchasing power no longer felt reliable. A similar turning point appeared in the Soviet Union in 1991. Official numbers showed that consumer prices rose more than 100% in a single year. Shops struggled to restock. Families began storing goods rather than cash. Insiders later said that this was the moment when people no longer believed the ruble would recover. Ordinary people felt these changes in simple ways. A teacher in Buenos Aires recalled in a 1989 interview that her monthly salary shrank in real value before payday arrived. She said the numbers on her payslip stayed the same, but groceries cost more each week. Have you ever watched a price rise so steadily that you began to plan purchases differently? This first shift in power always leads to the next step, and once it begins, it tends to accelerate in the same familiar direction. Behind every currency collapse, there is a mechanism that works quietly in the background. It is not a single decision. It is a chain of incentives that push governments toward printing more money than their economies can support. According to archived finance ministry files from several countries, the cycle begins when tax revenues fall while obligations continue to rise. Officials reportedly turn to short-term borrowing to bridge the gap. When lenders hesitate, the state issues new currency to meet payrolls, pensions, and essential services. Each new round of printing reduces the value of the existing supply. The process repeats because stopping it would require cuts that leaders fear voters will not accept. Machinery becomes clearer with a simple example. In Hungary, in 1945, monthly inflation rose to levels that made traditional accounting impossible. Businesses printed their own internal price sheets each morning. A tailor in Budapest later said he measured the value of the currency by how long it took customers to walk from his front door to the counter. Insiders often describe a moment when trust disappears. A banker in Moscow reportedly told colleagues in late 1991 that the ruble was becoming a hot potato. He said people wanted to pass it to someone else as quickly as possible. That loss of confidence is what turns a weakening currency into a collapsing one. Have you ever felt that officials were using tools that solved the day but ignored the month? Because once this mechanism starts operating at full speed, the consequences become harder to control, and the system begins to move toward its most dangerous stage. The outcome that surprises most people is how slowly the real damage appears. A currency often looks stable on the surface, even as its foundation weakens. Archived banking reports from Brazil in the late 1980s show that savings accounts still listed familiar balances while those same balances bought less each month. The numbers on the page stayed the same. The purchasing power quietly slipped away. One government memo from 1979. Argentina noted that consumer prices rose more than 100% in a single year. Officials allegedly reassured the public that the trend was temporary. But according to those same records, internal forecasts predicted far worse. The gap between public statements and private expectations widened with every report. People living through these years often remember the moment it became personal. A retired factory worker in Poland said he realized something was wrong the day he opened a letter showing his pension increase. The numbers looked generous. But at the market that same afternoon, he noticed that bread, meat, and cooking oil cost more than the raise he had just received. Have you ever looked at a familiar bill and wondered when routine expenses became difficult? Insiders reportedly reacted with caution. Some moved savings into hard goods. Others exchanged currency for whatever foreign money they could obtain. They were not speculating, they were defending themselves. This slow erosion creates a turning point that leads directly into the next and more visible phase. And that phase rarely arrives quietly. Escalation usually begins when governments run out of quiet options. The earlier tools no longer work, borrowing becomes expensive, public pressure rises. And officials turn to measures that signal a deeper struggle. According to archived central bank summaries from Yugoslavia in 1993, the money supply increased at rates that no one could control. Prices doubled in days instead of months. Shops shortened business hours because they could not update price tags fast enough. The financial system was no longer adjusting. It was reacting. International institutions sometimes step in at this stage. Records from the late 1970s show that Argentina negotiated repeated agreements with foreign lenders. Each carried conditions: reduce deficits, adjust interest rates, limit spending. But insiders reportedly admitted that these terms were almost impossible to meet while keeping the currency stable. So new money was printed to cover obligations, and inflation accelerated again. Ordinary people often remember the human details. A bakery owner in Russia recalled that in late 1992 he changed prices 3 times. A day customers stopped bringing small bills. They were worthless by the evening. He said the hardest part was explaining to older customers why their pensions no longer covered a week of groceries. Have you ever lived through a moment when prices climbed faster than your ability to plan for them? This escalation pushes the system toward an unavoidable pressure point. And the next stage arrives when that pressure finally breaks through the surface. The breaking point arrives when the system can no longer hide its internal strain. At this stage, the public sees changes not in reports or headlines but in daily routines. According to archived government notices from Zimbabwe in 2008, officials issued a $100 trillion note because smaller denominations had become useless. It was a symbolic moment. It showed that the currency had lost nearly all connection to real value. Pressure builds in financial institutions as well. In 1998, the Russian central bank announced that it could no longer defend the ruble within its target range. Interest rates were raised sharply. Banks struggled to meet withdrawals. Insiders later said that the phone lines inside major branches were filled with customers asking the same question: how much can I take out today? People remember the small details around these moments. A teacher in Belgrade said she watched a man pay for lunch with a stack of bills so thick that it barely fit into his coat pocket. He counted them slowly. She said it felt like watching a currency disappear in real time. Have you ever seen a situation where numbers kept rising but the meaning behind them kept disappearing? This is the point when the collapse becomes visible to everyone. And from here, a deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. When you step back from these crises, a clear pattern emerges. It is the same whether you study the German mark in 1923, the Chilean escudo in 1973, or the Yugoslav dinar in 1993. Different leaders, different politics, different continents, but the same structure repeats. A currency weakens, confidence slips, printing expands, prices rise, institutions lose control, and people retreat into assets that hold value outside the currency itself. Historical records show that families in Vienna during the 1923 crisis shifted savings into gold jewelry and foreign notes. In Buenos Aires during the 1989 hyperinflation, people bought durable goods on payday because refrigerators and furniture kept value longer than pesos. In Moscow in the early 1990s, workers were reportedly paid partly in goods instead of money because the goods retained worth while the ruble fell every week. The pattern is simple. When a currency collapses, people seek assets that do not depend on the promise of the issuing government. These assets show up in every documented crisis. They appear whether inflation is slow erosion or full hyperinflation. Do you notice how the same defensive moves appear across countries and decades? Understanding this pattern sets the stage for seeing which assets survived every collapse, and why those same 5 assets still matter today. The long-term consequences of this pattern shape daily life in ways most people never see directly. The same behaviors that protected families a century ago still appear during modern periods of instability. They simply take newer forms archived. Reports from Turkey between 2018 and 2022 show that households bought record amounts of gold coins when the lira lost value. Families treated gold not as an investment but as a store of stability. In Lebanon after 2019, people reportedly stored savings in US dollars inside their homes because bank withdrawals were restricted, old habits returned. Trust the asset, not the institution. Technology changed some details. Digital records from the Venezuelan crisis of the 2010s show that people used foreign digital currencies for everyday purchases because the bolivar lost value too quickly, but the underlying motive was the same: find something the local currency cannot erode. These echoes show how past decisions still influence the present, the quiet erosion of purchasing power, the shift towards safer stores of value, the search for stability outside official systems. They all follow the same rhythm found in earlier collapses. Have you ever wondered why some people seem prepared before a crisis even becomes visible? Because the lessons from these past collapses continue to guide how individuals protect themselves today. And those lessons lead directly toward the final frame of this story. The deeper meaning of these events becomes clear when you look at how people responded across generations. They did not rely on prediction. They relied on patterns, and those patterns pointed to the same 5 assets that held their value when every currency around them broke apart. History shows that gold remained a trusted refuge from Vienna in 1923 to Istanbul in recent years. Real estate kept practical worth because land and shelter met needs that did not disappear. Productive businesses survived because they generated value independent of any one currency. Foreign money acted as a bridge during transitions. And essential goods protected families when prices changed too quickly to follow. These assets endured not because they were perfect, but because they existed outside the promises that faltered when governments struggled. The same logic still applies today. People who understand these patterns do not react in fear. They make calm decisions long before the pressure becomes visible. Have you ever felt that preparing early is less about predicting a crisis and more about understanding how people navigated past ones? When you see the choices that helped families survive every documented currency collapse, you begin to understand the foundation beneath financial stability. And that brings us to the quiet conclusion of this journey. The stories from these collapses remind us that stability is something people build for themselves, not something they wait for. Families who protected their savings did it through simple, steady steps. They paid attention, they learned from others, and they chose assets that history had already tested. Every generation faces its own version of uncertainty, but the pattern of survival rarely changes. People look for value they can trust. They look for things that hold meaning beyond numbers on a bill. Which of these 5 enduring assets feels most relevant to your own life today? If you enjoy stories like this and want to explore more hidden financial patterns from history, feel free to stay with this channel. There is always another quiet lesson waiting in the archives.